Now, for this evening's talk, welcome Daniel-Joseph MacArthur-Seal. Just going to say a little bit about him. He is a research fellow at the Scuola Superiore Meridionale in Napoli, where he's investigating the history of the Istanbul opium trade during the age of prohibition. His doctoral thesis examined the role of the British military in the administration of urban centres occupied during the course of the First World War in the Eastern Mediterranean, most importantly in the city of Istanbul. So this is going to be the subject of his talk, and also the subject of his book, Britain's Levantine Empire. So do have a look at this afterwards, and I'm sure Daniel-Joseph will tell you how you can purchase it. After completing his PhD, he was appointed as a postdoctoral research fellow at the British Institute at Ankara, and from 2014 to 2017, then went to the Hong Kong Baptist University for a couple of years before returning to the British Institute at Ankara in the post of assistant director. And now I'm going to hand over to Daniel-Joseph MacArthur-Seal.
Thank you. Thanks for the welcome. I'm glad to be here. I mean, I've been corresponding with Craig about giving a lecture here for more than a year, maybe 2 years.
2 years. Yeah.
But it's actually the first time I've been back in the UK in almost 2 years. And even then, the last time I was here was for a very short period. So I haven't had much opportunity to engage with UK audiences about my book. Actually, it came out in 2021, but that was in the middle of the COVID pandemic, so all the kind of promotional activities were a bit delayed. So so forgive me for talking about it like it's something new, but it's not actually. This evening I'm going to be talking a little bit about the book, but also about my broader research engagement with Istanbul under occupation, and specifically I want to talk about the ways in which the occupation has been selectively remembered and for the most part forgotten. I'm going to be focusing on Britain and Turkey because these are both the chief protagonists in this story, but they're also the places where I've spent most of my research career, as you've just heard. So one of the notable things about the legacy of the occupation of Istanbul is the degree to which it's been forgotten by its protagonists. And very, very few people in Britain, France, or Italy are aware of the fact that their troops occupied this Ottoman capital city and lands on either side of the Bosphorus and Marmara Sea for almost 5 years. I mean, I even remember my own surprise learning that Britain had this role in occupying Istanbul when I was researching my undergraduate thesis. And it struck me as something that's so, of such a disproportion, there was such disproportionality between, the scale of this occupation and its place in history writing. So that's why I basically decided to write about it in my master's thesis and then my PhD thesis, which became the book. I mean, in a way, what makes this occupation having been forgotten understandable is the fact that took place at this very, very busy period where not just Britain, but also France, especially, and Italy, were in a kind of fit of colonial expansion. So, at the same time that Britain was occupying Istanbul, it was establishing its mandate in Palestine. France was fighting battles against the Arab nationalists in Syria. And given the kind of long afterlife of those conflicts and the legacy of those longer lasting occupations in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, it's perhaps understandable that British public and academic attention is much more focused on colonial expansion in the Arab world in this period. The occupation of Istanbul, just lasted 5 years, and in a way the British were quite successful in extracting themselves from this occupation in a way that, although it had, I would argue, very dire consequences for the local population, somehow the mud didn't stick on this particular occupation. And it's been largely viewed as a matter of diplomatic history rather than a matter of imperial or colonial history, as I try and do. So given that this period is quite obscure, even to some Turkish, well-read Turkish people, let alone people in the UK and France and so on, I'm going to sort of briefly go over the sequence of events of the occupation. So before I start to delve into how they've been thought about and written about. So, the occupation followed from the armistice that brought an end to the war between Britain and the Ottoman Empire. But the armistice, which is, some of the relevant clauses of which are pictured on screen. By the way, it was signed on this battleship, the Agamemnon. That's why that image is on screen. The armistice didn't explicitly specify that Istanbul would be occupied. And indeed, Ralph Orbay, who was the Ottoman signatory of the armistice, he said in his memoirs that Admiral Calthorpe, who was the British senior representative at this signing, he said that Calthorpe had assured him that Istanbul was not going to be occupied verbally, but when Ralph asked for such a clause to be added to the armistice, he was rebuffed. What Article 7 of the armistice stated, however, and you can see it on the right of the screen, was that the Allies have the right to occupy any point if there's a threat to Allied security. And so, in a way, that was how they justified their presence in Istanbul. But even this kind of expansive and vague clauses did not completely allay the concerns of legal experts in the British Foreign Office, who actually regularly warned the British officials in Istanbul that some of the actions that they were taking in the city, for example, practicing martial law, re-establishing the consular courts, did not have any legal basis, given that relations with the Ottoman Empire had been ruptured by a state of war, and the normal legal basis for an occupying regime is when the existing government has been incapacitated by of a belligerent power. But the British were permitting, or the Allies were permitting, the Ottoman government to continue functioning during this period, and so whether this was strictly an occupation or not was a matter of dispute. And so the legality of British action in Istanbul was also a matter of legal debate.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
Question in terminology that refers to the city's Constantinople. I think I'm right on the whole, that was the way in which the British were referring to the city.
Yeah.
For most of the period of the occupation.
Yeah, definitely. In my book, I use Constantinople because I set out in the book, I'm trying to use the terminology that was in use at the time. And the book is more focused on British thought about this city than it is on the Turkish. The British and Europeans in general used the word Istanbul but they meant by Istanbul, they just meant the historic peninsula. So Constantinople was the whole, and Istanbul was just a part of Constantinople. So there was different, and then there were also, Ottoman Turkish formulations of Constantinople as well that were sometimes used. But in general, in Turkish, Istanbul was already the predominant name for the city. So there was, as I was trying to explain, there was this uncertainty over the Allies' legal status in Istanbul, and that was matched by a more general uncertainty over the fate of the city under the terms of the coming peace treaty. So, it takes almost 2 years for a peace treaty to be signed between Britain and the Ottoman Empire after the armistice, which is much longer than anyone had expected or hoped for. Okay. Now, Istanbul, during the First World War, Istanbul and the area around it had been promised to Tsarist Russia as an ally. So when Britain and France were, famously carving up the Ottoman's Arab provinces, Russia's compensation was going to be Istanbul as well as the Armenian eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire. But because of the Bolshevik Revolution and and then subsequently Russia having signed a separate peace with the Central Powers, the British government decided towards the end of the war that, to quote, our hands are now entirely free in regard to both the control of the Straits and the disposal of Constantinople, end quote. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister at the time, David Lloyd George and Lord Curzon, were actually both determined that Istanbul should be separated from what would be left of Turkey, or what would be left of the Ottoman Empire. And they made suggestions that, for example, Bursa should become the new capital, as it had been before the conquest of Constantinople in the 15th century. But there was then a debate on, if Istanbul was to be separated from Turkey, how was this huge city of about 1 million people going to be governed? And you had a whole series of proposals. So there was obviously a strong movement towards internationalism in this period. This was when the League of Nations was being established. And there was a group in Britain, including some of the Labour Party MPs and some of the supporters of the League of Nations, who said that the League of Nations might be established in a neutral international city of Istanbul, rather than Geneva, where it ended up. And they pointed to other examples, places like Tangiers that had been under a kind of international urban administration already before the war, or the free city of Danzig that was created out of the peace treaty between, out of the division of the German Empire's territory. There were others, like notably the many Philhellenes in the government close to Lloyd George, who suggested that the city should be united with Greece. And then still others proposed that it might become a US or British mandate, perhaps including Anatolia or perhaps excluding Anatolia. But these advocates of these various schemes, they struggled to convince their French allies of the necessity of separating Istanbul from the rump Turkish state. And they also faced the objections, Lloyd George and Curzon faced the objections of a large part of the government, of the cabinet. There's also understandably, this uncertainty leads to a huge degree of speculation and public debate over what is going to be the future for the city. And notable Ottoman Turkish figures actually give their support to the idea of an American mandate, and this ends up being a burden that is used in the early Republican period to kind of label them as traitors, these supporters of an American mandate for the city or for Turkey more generally. This discussion of what to do with Istanbul was actually quite public. And it led to protest. I mean, protests in Istanbul, for example, this image is from January 1920, when there was a large demonstration in Sultanahmet Square. Now, these series of demonstrations in Sultanahmet Square in the the second half of 1919 are very well known. They were largely organized to protest against the occupation of Izmir, but this January 1920 protest, which was one of the last mass protests permitted in occupied Istanbul, its focus was about the future of the city, because it was in response to press discussion and press reporting that the Allies were considering depriving the Ottomans of Istanbul. And Nakia Hanım, who becomes an important teacher and educationist in the Turkish Republic, gives this long speech arguing saying that the Turks should not abandon the resting places of their ancestors, sultans, religious buildings, etc. So the focus of this demonstration is Istanbul rather than Izmir. But what's much more concerning to the British is not protest in Istanbul, but actually protest in India, because the idea that the Ottoman Sultan, who was Caliph of Sunni Islam, was going to be expelled from Istanbul was a major cause of concern for British Muslims all over the empire, or we can say, yeah, Muslim subjects of the British Empire. And there was a whole series of demonstrations organized in India. And the Indian delegation to Paris, who spoke at the peace conferences, they advocated in the strongest terms to allow the Sultan to remain in Istanbul. Okay, and this kind of within cabinet, this opposition was led by Edwin Montagu and the group of so-called Turkophile ministers, and they actually succeed in preventing any drastic change of status in Istanbul being included in the peace treaty that is later signed at Sèvres. So Sèvres ends up, perpetuating actually this uncertainty around the status of Istanbul, because while it leaves the Ottomans officially sovereign in Istanbul, other clauses in the treaty say that this decision will be revisited if the clauses of the peace treaty are not respected. Okay, so there's this kind of threat that Istanbul could be separated from Turkey in future if Turkey does not comply with the peace treaty. So the Allies were basically both in being present militarily in Istanbul and through the treaty were hoping to use the city as a way of applying pressure on the Turkish government to conform to its broader demands. But this strategy obviously foundered because of the split because of the organization of the national movement in Anatolia and the foundation of the Turkish parliament in Ankara, which was well beyond the reach of these limited number of Allied forces who remained concentrated in the city. And so by the end of 1922, once the Greek offensive towards Ankara has been beaten back, and eventually Greece has been completely defeated in Anatolia, they suddenly realize that they're in this untenable position, that the Allied troops, some 20,000 Allied troops in Istanbul are not going to be able to hold the city against the Turkish nationalist forces if they attack. And the situation is summarized quite nicely by Neville Henderson, who's the acting High Commissioner, the acting senior diplomat on the spot, who wrote, to quote, "Instead of holding Constantinople as a pledge, we should be in the position of hostages." So whilst this kind of strategic and diplomatic decision making is being made about what's going to happen to Istanbul, these kind of, committee meetings on the future of Istanbul, which take place well into 1920, whilst this kind of abstract discussion is taking place, there's a concrete process happening on the ground where British and other Allied representatives are establishing a kind of supervisory government almost in the city, okay? And this takes the form of a kind of semi-colonial regime to govern Istanbul. So whilst the Ottoman government and the Ottoman mayoralty continues to exist, huge areas of governance are subjected to these supervisory committees that include Allied representatives. So first they, for example, take over supervision of the Ottoman police. But then there are more and more committees established governing things like the supply of coal to the city, the regulation of sanitation, the issuing of passports and visas. You can see, by the way, not very clearly, unfortunately, but this illustration on the right-hand side shows the Allied kind of power structure in Istanbul and the fact that there are basically these multiple different committees, and each committee is very carefully composed so that, British, French, and Italian interests are balanced. And there's a huge degree of a backstory to this, is that there's this breakdown in the relationship, especially between Britain and France over this period, okay? And there's a part of that is because of this rivalry for control, who gets to be the president on which committee, who gets influence in which area of the Ottoman government, etc. So, Lord Curzon, who was by then foreign minister, back before the end of the war, he had specifically said, to quote, "No British government would dream of the assumption of so vast and perilous a charge as the administration of Constantinople." But because there was just this complete absence of central direction, Britain was basically in a very dreamlike way, embarking on this course of more and more becoming responsible for the governance of the city. And these kind of decisions to take responsibility for specific areas like sanitation, policing, etc., they followed from there's a kind of intrinsic logic of occupation. Because once you have 20,000 odd troops in a city, it seems that in order to kind of provide for their physical security, their health, their moral well-being, you have to then extend your controlling gaze to the city in which they're stationed. So, you know, soldiers are going into the city at night and drinking bootleg alcohol and going and ending up, you know, sick. And so, okay, in that case, we need to regulate alcohol provision in Istanbul and make sure that, you know, everything is to standard, or we need to make sure that the food, you know, that food hygiene is up to scratch. We need to make sure that places of residence near to the military camps are subjected to sanitary inspection. And there's this kind of, there's a kind of a mission, what they would call now mission creep, you know, where just the mere presence of these soldiers and the leads to this expansion of colonial style control in the city. And these kind of measures, they are what really bring the experience of colonial rule to Istanbul's residents. So it was these interactions with soldiers, both who are enforcing new regulations and carrying out security operations, but also engaging with the city in their off-duty time as, you know, patrons of bars or as theatre goers or musicians, that bring this experience of occupation to the city, to the city's residents. And these kind of daily interactions with soldiers are fill the memoirs of Turkish nationalists and others, you know, who write on their life in the city in this period. And the reason that these interactions, which may well otherwise have been pleasant, are characteristic of imperialism is because these British soldiers are protected from prosecution by local authorities and are themselves actually empowered to fine, arrest, and imprison local subjects without any kind of due process. This in itself even becomes a cause of concern to British officers who find that they have all of these people in prison who they don't even know why they're in there, because they're being sentenced to they've been given short sentences following verbal processes that have not been recorded. And so these kind of very predictable abuses of power that follow further alienates, particularly the Turkish population. So it's this kind of official and unofficial dual-sided construction of imperial rule in Istanbul that was at the center of my doctoral research, which is now published as the book on the table. Unfortunately, these are the only two copies I have left, and I'm after this going to see my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, my examiner, and I better give them a copy. So I cannot sell any of them here, but you can still find it for sale online. And if you get in touch with me after, I might be able to get some kind of discount. I don't know. So this kind of what I'm trying to do here by bridging this political and personal, political and personal worlds, I did by my choice of sources. Okay. So I in my doctoral research, I went out and tried to find the private letters, the diaries, the memoirs of British officers and officials who had served in Istanbul, Alexandria, and Thessaloniki, which were my case studies. And I managed to locate about 100 officers and officials who had private papers related to their experience there. Just one of them is on the screen here. This is Miles, Walter Harold Miles, who was a British control officer in Istanbul. He was sent to Samsun, and he meets Ataturk just after in Amasya, by his own recollection, which is just at the cusp in which Ataturk is kind of breaking with imperial authority and beginning the War of Independence. But he also spends, as you can see from these photos, he spends quite a lot of time in Istanbul in 1919. So there are many kind of similar archives in places like this one is in Leeds Liddell collection, so a big military archive, but there are lots and lots of other papers in the National Army Museum, in the Liddell Hart Centre for Military Archives at King's College London, and in the Imperial War Museum. And when you read these kind of this testimony alongside state documents produced by like the British Foreign Office and the War Office, you start to see the connections between individual behaviors and government policy. And I'll try and illustrate some of that connection now. So I'm going to show you 3 very unpleasant reactions to Istanbul, written by British officers and journalists. Before I do that, yeah, most of that kind of academic interest in soldiers' writing has basically been focused on what this can tell us about factors that determines, military outcomes like battlefield morale, or just looked at them as a source of information for additional information about the conditions of various campaigns. But what I was much more interested in is what these letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal about soldiers and sailors and officials' understanding and behaviors away from the front lines, and how these impacted their local environment. So in this trio of quotes, you can see the kind of clear feelings of disgust that animated many British visitors to post-war Istanbul. There are, by the way, there were appreciations of the city generally when people were on ships and first got sight of it, which was then contrasted by the kind of this feeling of physical assault almost that takes place once you're in the street. And what British authorities responded to these kind of complaints with efforts at controlling the circulation of individuals in the city. So Kennedy, he wished that there would be a fire that would burn down the city and allow them to rebuild it from scratch. Of course, there are a very large number of individual small fires, but nothing of that scale. But he then relates this kind of his feeling of disgust to his official duties. He writes about, to quote, searching all the men he met in the dark, narrow streets and those sitting in the wretched little cafes. And there were other regulations that addressed this kind of visceral reaction. So, they would restrict. There were regulations that restricted prostitutes from soliciting soldiers on the streets and confined them indoors. There were other regulations that restricted street vendors from where they could ply their trades. Okay, so this kind of what seemed like very personal individual responses to the city are, I believe, linked to the kind of efforts at imposing order and organization and sanitation on Istanbul that the British and their allies carried out. And my more recent research has turned to how the people of Istanbul responded to the arrival of these soldiers rather than how these soldiers responded to Istanbul and its people. But in doing that, you face a major dilemma, which is the way in which 1923 in Turkey acts as a kind of caesura in Turkish politics, and the way in which the creation of a secular nation state, i.e. the Republic of Turkey, becomes the inescapable telos of the preceding years. So this caesura in Turkish history distorts memoir writing. And so memoirs that you see produced in the Republican era, they often eradicate all of the alternative futures and alternative aspirations that the city's population expressed in these previous years. Many of the memoirs you see were written by, Ottoman Turkish officials and officers who had remained in Istanbul and not crossed to join Turkish national forces in Anatolia, and were very much aware that they were under scrutiny because after 1923, Turkish officials who had not joined the War of Independence were subject to review boards who could expel them from their positions. Many important figures who had stayed in Istanbul lost their positions because they were judged to have not acted, patriotically enough during the occupation period. And so some of these memoirs, you see this very obvious attempt to emphasize just how hard these Istanbul-based officials had it, and just how patriotic and how supportive they had been, at least in spirit, to the national movement, right? So this obviously distorts the picture we have of Istanbul prior to 1923. And so in order to kind of uncover and do justice to the diversity of thoughts that existed in the early armistice era, you need diverse sources. So the most obvious place to go for this is the Ottoman archives, which are full of petitions and assessments of public feeling about aspects of the occupation. You also see in the archive, a large degree of frustration at the inability of Ottoman authorities to prevent and prosecute the crimes of Allied servicemen, from petty theft to physical and sexual assault. Allied soldiers were seen to be getting away lightly or completely scot-free because they were only subject to the discipline of their commanding officers and not the Ottoman police or courts. That another interesting source is pictured on screen, which is that the Allies themselves were very interested in monitoring public feeling through their extensive intelligence network. They had informants, a large number of informants, and also through the surveillance of letters and telegrams. So that's what is on this screen. These are like, for the first months of the occupation, they were producing these weekly summaries. They were basically reading everyone's mail and compiling interesting extracts that gave a sense of how Istanbul residents felt about the end of the war, the armistice, the presence of the Allies. From this, you see, from these kind of reports, you get this sense that there is a huge variety in feeling at this period. And that variety is important to emphasize because, of course, in Turkish national accounts written after 1923, the only thing that's really said about Istanbul under occupation is the kind of extent of hardship and poverty and moral depravity that was witnessed in the city, which is certainly one part of it. But you also see on the part, especially obviously, of non-Muslim residents of Istanbul, hopes. But even particularly in this early period, you also see that there are many Turkish Muslims who are hoping that whatever comes next would at least be better than the unionist rule that they've experienced during the war. But as time progresses, particularly after the occupation of Izmir in 1919 and the formal occupation of Istanbul in March 1920, the position of Turkish Muslims shifts towards increasing resentment and resistance to Allied policy. Even though the national movement in Ankara, was far from having a monopoly on the loyalty of Istanbul's Muslim subjects. And by November 1922, the future of the city's major communities appears to be fixed. This era of uncertainty has come to an end. And Muslims gather to celebrate the entry of the Ankara government's representatives in Istanbul, Refet Pasha. That's the image on the right when Refet arrived to Istanbul, and you can see the streets that he would pass through are decorated with these triumphal arches and Turkish flags. A very different image to the one that's on the cover of this talk, where you see a huge number of Greek flags, or others where you'll see the Allied flag also flying in the city. Whilst city's Greek and Armenian population starts to make preparations to leave. And this is an image from the book of Marsubian. It's an orphanage that had previously been evacuated from Samsun, had arrived in Istanbul, and realizing it was no longer safe to stay in Istanbul either, continued on to Greece. And so this kind of dramatic and oftentimes violent transition of power in Istanbul eradicated the complexities and the many possibilities that had been contained within the previous 4 years. And it also then removed the kind of concern with these alternative futures from the minds of historians, for whom such an outcome appeared now an inevitability. The creation of a Turkish national republic seemed like the inevitable culmination of this period, and therefore all of these other hopes for, I don't know, a constitutional liberal monarchy, or even, you know, socialist revolution, or enosis with Greece, etc., you know, these kind of fall to the wayside. And the same kind of process at the end of occupation makes it physically harder to reconstruct the experience of late Ottoman Istanbul, because, you know, the capital is transferred to Ankara, and with the departure of so many of the city's residents, personal and state archives are interrupted and displaced. As a result, excavating these kind of globally dispersed sources for the study of occupation era Istanbul is extremely challenging. It requires research trips to multiple countries and the acquisition of many languages, which is something, you know, beyond the realm of possibility for most individual historians. On the screen on the left is just a kind of taster of some of the archives we have to study Istanbul. The top left is a report on Greek refugees from Anatolia prepared by the Patriarchate. In the middle is a report created by this Armenian National Committee on which lists all of the orphans that have arrived from Anatolia and are now in the care of Armenian orphanages in Istanbul. The next image is a typical meeting of the Allied High Commissioners. They would meet every week, and if you look at the kind of agenda of the meeting, you see that they're dealing with all kinds of questions well beyond what you would expect of this kind of authority. So they're talking about when bars should close at night, or, you know, what the price of bread should be, or, you know, they kind of end up in this position of micromanaging life in the city. The two tables at the bottom, one is a daily crime report produced by the Inter-Allied Police. It tells you who was arrested, for what infraction, who the victim was, and what was the nature of the offence. And you have that every single day for years and years of the, you know, duration of the occupation. And then the middle one is death reports. So you have every single day, you can see who died in Istanbul and what disease or other cause of death was. So you have basically my point here is to show that you have sources available for the study of Istanbul under occupation, which are really unparalleled in the years before or after, because you have so much international attention on the city. And so even when you're investigating matters of social history that don't seem so obviously connected to the occupation, like disease or crime, you have a level of sources available to you that you can produce, I think, and people are still working, need to still work on this longer, you know, you can produce very innovative research. At the same time, of course, you have all of these soldiers writing diaries, you have all of these private visitors writing their accounts of Istanbul in this period. And you have to remember that after 1923, you suddenly lose access to a whole series of archives, like, for example, the Ministry of Health, like the Emniyet Genel Müdürlüğü. You know, all of these archives, once you cross into the Republican era, remain closed to historians. And so this is really a period of unparalleled wealth in sources. And one of the things I tried to do more recently is create this, with my colleague at the British Institute at Ankara, create this open access bibliography for the study of Armistice Istanbul. And all of these kind of sources, as well as all of the secondary literature published prior to 2021 is in there, and it's available to download. Of course, in order to access all of that material, you need to you can't really work alone, and you need to engage in collaboration, because Istanbul is such a large and complex city at this period that, as I mentioned, you know, you need a diversity of languages, of research skills, methodologies in order to kind of uncover and do justice to the city. And it's that same approach that guided my work on the recently concluded exhibition, Meşgul Occupied City. So this exhibition ran from early 2023 until April passed at the Istanbul Research Institute in Beyoğlu. And of course, we were working with a limited amount of space. You can see a three-dimensional reconstruction of the exhibition area. It's just 3 rooms in a corridor. And so it was impossible to, in this small air space, represent the complexity of Istanbul, even in such a short time frame. So what was then important to us was to kind of choose objects and artworks which were representative of the experience of different genders, social and ethnic groups, etc., while demonstrating at the same time the kind of overarching imperialist structure which conditioned and constrained individual experiences. And so we did that by bringing in consultants. So we worked together with a group of 6 consultants who were specialists in Turkish labor history, in the Armenian and Greek populations of Istanbul, and in French diplomatic and military history, so that together with my own expertise and that of my co-curator, we felt confident that we could provide a kind of comprehensive picture of the city. And we also had one consultant specialized on Russian cultural history, which is particularly important because you had in excess of 100,000 refugees from the Russian Empire living in Istanbul by the end of 1920 as a result of the Russian Civil War. So you have all of these different groups cohabiting, coexisting in Istanbul, but too often their histories are told in a kind of communally bounded fashion in which other communities appear just as antagonists or oppressors without really having any nuance. So Istanbulites, Greeks and Armenians, they often fall through the cracks in their respective national histories, which are focused on, catastrophe and genocide experienced by their kinsmen in Anatolia, but which, to some degree, those Greeks and Armenians in Istanbul were able to escape from. But that's something that, there are new researchers on these Istanbul groups by people like Dimitris Kamoutsis and Ari Shakayan that kind of show the distinctive experience of Istanbul-based Greeks and Armenians now, which is something to welcome. And even though there are a growing number of Turkish historians who have trained internationally and who employ, Ottoman Turkish as well as other languages of the empire, it's unfortunately still common to encounter, Turkish articles and even entire books on Armenians and Greeks as kind of problems, which don't cite a single source produced by these communities and just rely entirely on the kind of securitized perspective of the Ottoman state and key figures of the period, key Turkish figures of the period. So as the exhibition was going to be an intervention in public history, I wanted to kind of counter the mutual suspicions of this period, which emerged from these kind of segregated histories, by emphasizing the commonality of experiences between different groups in the city. And I just have a nice example of that on the screen. So I came across these 2 rather similar images from very close together places. One is in Armutlu, which is on the south. This, by the way, this map you see the orange part in the north is Istanbul, and this is the southern shore of the Marmara down below. And so from 2 piers in Mudanya and in Armutlu, you have 2 groups of refugees gathering, waiting to be evacuated to occupied Istanbul. The first group are Muslims who are fleeing the advance of the Greek army in 1921. And the second group are Christians, mostly Greek Christians, who are fleeing the return of Turkish forces to this region. And they both, interestingly, end up evacuated to Istanbul, which really becomes like a refuge for all comers in a sense under this period. Yeah, these images are juxtaposed in the exhibit, or intended to be juxtaposed in the exhibition to show that there is a kind of degree of similarity to how the Ottoman Empire's various communities experienced this time, even if they're represented as very different. Some statistics of the Greek refugees from Anatolia, and an image showing Russian refugees living in the ruins of Istanbul. As mentioned, the city had became this kind of home of refugees from all places. You had Muslims fleeing Thrace that was under Greek occupation. You had Armenians and Greeks fleeing Eastern Anatolia, which had come under the control of the Turkish national movement. And in addition, you had this huge number of Russian refugees who were joining, and then there were already, tens of thousands of refugees from the Balkan Wars in the city. It produced these very striking image that so disgusted, British soldiers, where you had, people really literally living in the ruins, amid the ruins. So I think one just important caveat, which is that, this appeal to recognize common suffering can only be a starting point, and it doesn't eliminate the need to search for justice or the identification of perpetrators and victims, even if in this very short period, oftentimes you would see perpetrators becoming victims and victims becoming perpetrators. I'll finish by talking a little bit about the reaction to the exhibition. So there was a problem. I mean, in an exhibition, it's very different, as I learned, it was my first experience of doing it, it's very different to writing a book or giving a lecture, where you have a linear narrative that everyone has to kind of follow along with. In an exhibition, you can choose to start here, or you can start here, and you can skip that part entirely if you like. And that allows for people to make a very selective reading of what the evidence that's presented. And one of the things that I realized, through responses to the exhibition was just how deeply entrenched the dominant historical narratives of the late Ottoman period are in Turkey, particularly. So many visitors could just focus on convenient stories and images while ignoring or minimizing others as kind of minor inconveniences. And the visitor's book provides this fascinating evidence of the strength of these selective readings and the affirmation of preconceived ideas. So some, there's this guy on the top left, he was offended by how there were all of these images in which Turkish civilians and soldiers were being humiliated. And he asked, why didn't we show the capture of British soldiers in Mesopotamia, for example? Interestingly, this celebration of this Ottoman victory in Kut al-Amara was added to the kind of calendar of public history in Turkey under Erdogan, quite recently. In a way that, the occupation of Istanbul still has not attained this level of public recognition. Probably because it's seen by many people as a humiliation rather than a victory. And people came away with very surprising conclusions, like the one person at the bottom who said that the exhibition, reminded them of how great Ataturk was, which he had a very minor presence in the exhibition, like he has he was only in occupied Istanbul for a few months at the beginning of this period, and doesn't come back to Istanbul until 1927, interestingly. And some of the media response was equally selective in the way it interpreted this exhibition. So newspapers like Cumhuriyet, they emphasized only the kind of materials that spoke to the injustices and cruelties of the occupation on the Turkish population and ignored any kind of counter narrative. And maybe the most clear example of the way in which the kind of diverse story that we were trying to portray was kind of literally cut and cropped was this documentary produced by Tari TV, which is on the top right. And I don't have the recording here, but basically they asked me in the interview, what what the response was in Istanbul to Turkish victory in Anatolia. And I started my answer by saying, of course, the Muslim population of the city were very enthusiastic, and there were celebrations. And then I went on to say how for the Christian, Armenian Greek Christian population, by contrast, this was a source of anxiety, and they started to look for ways to escape. And many, tens of thousands of them fled before the Turkish army finally arrived in 1923 for fear of, their lives and economic security. And at that point, they just it fades into some music, and only this kind of confirmation of the Turkish narrative was permitted, the rest was on the editing room floor, as they say. Okay. I lost control of my. Yeah. So in the event, the reaction to the exhibition was actually quite positive, largely positive and engaging, despite these kind of disappointing examples of selective readings. And we were sort of served by this early controversy over the name of the exhibition, which attracted a lot of attention before we even opened the exhibition. Oh, okay. There we go. I lost my mouse from it. Anyway, basically, I'm too far. Basically, we decided in this kind of deliberate wordplay to call it Meshgul Shihir rather than, Ishgal, Altunda Shihir or something similar. Because these two words, Meshgul and Ishgal, have the same Arabic root. And because as you'll see, in the period we're talking about, Meshgul was used as an adjective to mean occupied, not just busy, as it generally means in contemporary Turkish. But that kind of dual meaning of Meshgul has fallen out of public use, and so people were very concerned that we were either trying to hide the fact that the city was occupied, or that we had actually just erroneously translated the word. I mean, not realizing that we had one native English speaker, one native Turkish speaker as curator. And it led to this huge kind of Twitter debate about what we were doing. Thankfully, we had some defenders who pointed out that, words like, terms like memalik I meşgule meant occupied provinces or occupied territories, and it was used in this way at the time. And some people even appreciated this wordplay as one of this nice comment with a pretty drawing appeared in the visitor's book. I think, what's interesting is that it wasn't just Turkish people who were reading this exhibition, with a mind to their own political priorities. Viewers of the exhibition were searching for lessons to be drawn from the history of occupation. And they related the features of occupied Istanbul to the present day. So, we had a section that talked about hyperinflation. Of course, anyone who's been to Turkey recently will realize that inflation is kind of back at 1919 levels again. We talked about the arrival of refugees, which is again a subject that is all over today's Turkish press. We've had these very ugly kind of lynchings in the last weeks while I was in Turkey, taking place in Kayseri and other places. And we have, maybe a bit less now, but we had this sense of political despair and this desire for salvation, in Istanbul and in Turkey more generally. And for international visitors, there were alternative comparisons, like the Taiwanese state news read this piece talking and compared occupied Istanbul to occupied Shanghai in World War II, and maybe speculated on, the prospect of a Chinese occupation of Taipei. And there were daily protests of Ukrainians on Mashrutia Odessa, just opposite the exhibition. And some of them came to the exhibition, and one even wrote, Slava Ukraina in the visitors book, somehow thinking maybe, that making a comparison between the Ottoman Empire's division and occupation and Ukraine's occupation and division today. And I'll just, and then again, this very, I thought, very poignant message at the end. It says, "Buson olsun, Buson, güzel Istanbul." So let this be the last occupation of the city. I think I'll finish there. I have a lot more to say about, but it gets into kind of very dry historiography. So I think at that point we can think about that in the question and answer.
Sure. Excellent. Thank you very much, Daniel, for that excellent talk. Fascinating. So we've got time for questions, and we've got people online. So Craig, if you can monitor, if you're online, want to make a comment or put a question, can you do that in the chat? While Craig is looking at that, does anyone like to open the questions? Yes.
I've got two questions. One is about the inter-allied police force, which you mentioned. Were these military police or are these civilian police? And if the latter, where did they come from? Because military you can post wherever you like. Civilians, how are they hiring civilian police?
Yeah, no, they're military officers from the occupation forces who were like given this task of. So there's no civilian police force established. Interestingly, there are proposals to make this like a more permanent feature of Istanbul under Sevra. Like they want to create like a municipal police force that would have, foreign supervision as something permanent. And they think about this. They're thinking about this in other places too. Like in Palestine, they create a civilian police force. I mean, where they bring British police officers over to Palestine. And they're talking about doing similar things in Istanbul, but no, it just remains a kind of, it's basically, they supervise the Ottoman police, and they also have a couple of hundred like military police officers who have to respond to all of these incidents involving Allied soldiers. Yeah.
Okay, and I have one other question, if I may, and that's about the attitude of ministers, cabinet ministers, and other senior people in Britain, as to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire seems to have been much worse treated than Germans. Okay, the Germans lost their colonial territories, but Germany itself was pretty much whole. Whereas with the Ottomans, I mean, there were plans to hive off whole chunks of it and leave the territory with a little bit of Anatolia.
Yeah.
Did anybody question whether that was right, wrong, or?
Yeah, it was the subject of division in the cabinet. I mean, firstly, one should say, of course, the Ottoman Empire was treated very differently.
Bearing in mind that they had not actually attacked directly Britain or France, Russia, but Russia was already gone, and they hadn't even declared war on America. So,
So there's different like one of the reason that like Lloyd George wants to treat the Ottoman Empire so harshly is, I mean, his stated reason, his public reason is the fact that he thinks that the Ottomans have proven that they're not capable of ruling other races. That's his argument. And so, of course, what happens in the division of the Ottoman Empire is they give large territories that are majority Muslim to the administration of Greece and other powers, but of course they see those European imperial powers as having the ability to rule other races, whereas they've decided now that the Turks do not have the ability to rule other races. But of course, this is a very, Orientalist kind of colonial hierarchy that they're functioning according to. So that's why it makes sense for them. But in terms of, there are people opponents to this. The one I mentioned is the most important, Edwin Montagu. He was also interestingly, he's come up a couple of times in the current debates that result, about the Balfour Declaration and what's going on in Gaza, because he was also opposed to the Balfour Declaration, opposed to the establishment of the Jewish national home in Palestine. He was also a big critic of the division of the Ottoman Empire. He was the Secretary of State for India, so he was reflecting the concerns of Indian Muslims basically in this policy, and he ends up losing his job because he publicly speaks out against the Turkish policy of the British government that he's a part of. But there are others too who are who are critical. There are divisions between, this is a coalition government at the time, and so, Lloyd George and Curzon, they agree very, about this, kicking the Turks out of Istanbul at the beginning, but within a couple of years, they have very different policies towards Turkey. And because of the strength of Turkish resistance, there's advocates within the cabinet and within all different ministries of the British government already by 1920, 21, saying we should reconcile with the Turkish nationalists and revise the Treaty of Sevres. And it's really Lloyd George and his closest allies who are the ones who are who would hold out to the end and want to enforce this division of the Ottoman Empire until it's kind of too late for them to do anything about it, really.
But I mean, most people seem to have agreed with Lloyd George. I mean, Montagu, he's taking a very particular Indian view and how it affects India. But I mean, if you take Montagu out of the picture, I can't find anybody else who thinks that there's something wrong with this.
Well, by the end, it changes over the time. By the end, they get rid of Lloyd George, right? By the end,
Britain itself is exhausted by war, doesn't really want to stay there anymore. I mean, British opinion will change for British national reasons. But I'm thinking right at the beginning.
No, because this government is operating in this is like the high point of colonialism. So the idea that Britain should, divide up territory, allocate it to its allies, that it would better govern a place than Ottomans or anyone else is quite natural. But it's part of the culture, like imperialist culture of this period in the British, ruling elite.
Take a question from Vera Constantine.
Yes. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I think, well, my question is somehow connected to the question before. I think there was a problem in the vision that the British had of the Ottoman Empire. There's a constant in the sources that I had the chance to see, there's a constant will to codify under national or religious identity, which was not always the case. I mean, even Montagu, after all, is not far from the same problem because he only takes the side of the Muslims, but it's still another sort of identitarian codification. What is missing, and my question is precisely this, how did the British perceive, the British administration in Istanbul perceived the political engagement of the heterogeneous groups that actually joined the Kemalist resistance? For example, people like Emanuel Karas, who was a Jewish, Italian-speaking subject of the Ottoman Empire, and he participated to the Kemalist resistance, not because he was Jewish, not because he was Italian speaker, but because he was politically involved. So I always think that this perspective of accepting that in the East there is a political involvement, there is a political consciousness, that is the problem. It's always been rejected. And until it's like that, and then up until the moment when a sort of political involvement beyond religious belonging, beyond ethnic belonging is not accepted, and will always be an object. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, let me see if I got your question right. Sure, the British, they're viewing the Ottoman Empire through these kind of, if you imagine, they're looking at these demographic maps, which can only portray one color or another. There's very little room in those to kind of to show the kind of hybridity of late Ottoman culture, no matter, I mean, one has to say that, you know, this kind of Ottomanist, pluralist possibility for the empire is very damaged by what happened in the First World War, obviously. And of course, they, you know, what is like this kind of Turkish, this Islamic Turkish nationalism that is at the center of the resistance movement. Yeah, there are selected people who are incorporated into that, non-Muslims who are incorporated into that. And of course, they, you know, Turkishness itself is a pluralist kind of category because it includes Arnavut's and whoever else wants to become one. They don't recognize this, you know, that there is a kind of civil Turkish identity on one end of this Turkish political spectrum that survives into the Republic. That's true. There's an illustrative story, you know, there's this silly story where Lloyd George is meant to be like looking at a map and trying to consult with his advisors on the division of the Ottoman Empire, and he supposedly mistakes the topographical map for the demographic map and says, you know, if you look at the inland areas, it's all Turkish, but the coasts are all Greek, and it's just because it's green and brown, you know, according to the altitude. So they have this kind of, obviously they're, you know, these are people running an empire who are looking for simplifications because they've got, you know, they've got the Ottoman, they've got Istanbul at 1 p.m. and at 2 p.m. they're discussing what to do in Ireland, and at 3 p.m. they're discussing what to do in you know, the Straits settlements or whatever. So they look for simplifications. And the most, you know, the strongest simplification of the period is this kind of racial hierarchy that they've been operating with for the decades, you know, based on this idea of, you know, who is competent to rule and who isn't, right? And the Ottomans are seen, like I mentioned, the Ottomans are seen to have fallen out of this category of someone that can rule others, which the British are very firmly part of. So there are, I mean, what I think is interesting that goes on in political terms in Istanbul is that there are all of these actually civic, trans-communal, cross-communal political engagements that aren't outside of the framework of a, you know, Turkish nationalism. For example, you know, there's a big discussion of the need to re-establish this like common Ottomanism between Armenians and Greeks and Turks. There's a large discussion of the fact, you know, there's a large amount of recrimination towards the Young Turk movement, and you know, especially obviously this comes up in like, you know, Ottoman liberal politics, that, you know, they need to kind of atone for the crimes of the war and you know, gain the confidence of non-Muslims, but largely from, you know, from the perspective of Ottoman Greeks and Armenians, at least in terms of their political elites, it's too late, you know, and they basically see an opportunity to advocate for autonomy or enosis, and that's what they're pushing for. So this kind of effort to reconcile comes too late, really, understandably, given, you know, the trauma of what happens in World War I. But there are other that's kind of establishing these like trans-ethnic or cross-communal organizations, like the trade union movement is a good example. And you have, you know, these socialist parties that are publishing in, you know, Greek and Armenian and Ottoman Turkish, you know, newsletters to the workers, and you have, and in people's day-to-day interactions, of course, like there is still this kind of conviviality, amazingly surviving all of this trauma. And you know, I was reading a friend's chapter. He was, you know, talking about how a lot of the Black Sea Pontus Greeks who arrived to Istanbul, who survived, you know, the like Topal Osman's raids and stuff, they do it because they've been smuggled to the city by Muslim neighbors, you know, from the region around Samsun. And there's even even though there are these official boycotts, like, you know, in Istanbul, there's this effort, this nationalist boycott of non-Turkish goods and products and services. There are, you know, this Greek businessman talks about how he makes like invoices to his Turkish business partners using the name like Mehmet Effendi, so that they can say that they bought it from a Muslim, they didn't buy it from a Greek. So this I would say that this Ottoman conviviality, it puts up a fight, you know, but it doesn't the politics of the time don't give it much of a chance to reestablish itself.
Okay, so we've got Camelia, first, and then, yeah, and then,
I was going to ask, what the British thought of the Ottoman administration systems at the time, like the structures that are now, the Ottoman provinces as well as Istanbul.
Yeah.
Or if they had like eroded, and also how easy it was to get in and out of the city. You did mention the two different types of refugees coming in, but I guess that was a time of population exchanges as well, and loads of people being.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of, well, they thought they were very deficient, but this is like a classic kind of imperial logic, right? Which is that you always, you know, whenever a British officer looks at some administration of something or another, they say it's very inefficient, it's very corrupted, and it's not going to improve unless, you know, we have a bigger supervisory role or a bigger you know, more oversight. So there's this like, that's why I talked about this like logic of occupation, logic of this kind of colonial logic at work, which is they always find that the Ottomans administration of everything is deficient and needs supervision.
But was that practically accurate?
Well, I don't know, it depends how you assess these things. I mean, of course, like there are, I don't know if I can get into, I can really say whether like Ottoman administration was efficient or inefficient, but you can see that the way in which those kind of arguments are like instrumentalized to justify expansion of control. And one of the things that the Sevres vision of the Ottoman Empire is like it builds on what had already been happening. Like there was already like a European debt administration.
Yeah.
There was already like foreign military missions with like to reform the Ottoman gendarmerie, army and navy, etc. And so Sevres has this like kind of basically formalizes this, and instead of it being a kind of invitation on the basis of invitation, it becomes part of the system, which was that there'll be even stronger debt administration, like supervising all aspects of Ottoman public finance. There'll be supervision of the Ottoman railways. There'll be supervision of the Istanbul police, and there's this kind of it's a contradiction because at the same time the British are very cautious. At least they always say that they don't want to take on extra responsibilities, that they don't want to get involved, but this kind of colonial logic always says, you know, that they basically come to this conclusion that the Ottomans cannot rule, and so you need, and they're embedding themselves in Ottoman administration partly as well, fearing that they don't do it, the French will or the Italians will, and they'll get the upper hand, you know.
And the British mandate elsewhere, like in Palestine, were they built from scratch, or were they built?
Yeah, they were different. I mean, it depends where. Like Palestine is more like direct rule. Whereas, although then you have the Jewish agency being established, and it becomes like a state in itself.
That's later on.
Yeah, but in Iraq, they decide to kind of create this monarchy and create a so-called like indigenous administration. And in Istanbul, you have something that's very hybrid because it's like both. There's not just the British. There's like the allies are cooperating together, and they just it's done through all of these kind of committees. It's an interesting case because it reflects like both this kind of imperialist ideas and also this new like internationalist ideas, some kind of hybrid of the two systems. Yeah.
okay, thank you. Question behind it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is really interesting that, that last statement that they made about just the complexity of the time that they were passing through. And I mean, the thing with Ottoman institutions, I think, just on that last question is that, Ottoman Empire was a pre-modern empire, and the institutions hadn't quite, sort of got themselves up to scratch in terms of market forces and how you manage a sort of industrialized economy or anything like that. So it was all terribly, they weren't up to very much, and it's not surprising that the sort of the poverty and the terrible state that Istanbul was in after also 10 years of war. Of course, what institutions would survive that? Although, some countries, the institutions get stronger during war. But obviously this was a kind of dissolving empire. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the Ottoman army, also the Republican forces. And I'm not a historian, but we have my grandfather fought in the National Liberation War, etc. And they were based somewhere around Bursa, Yenişehir. They were a kind of band of independent forces which coordinated with Kemalist bits of the Ottoman army, but they were independent. They would be attacked by Ottoman brigades that were sent and instructed by Britain and the Sultan, insofar as they had any say on it. So they were fighting on two fronts to some extent. And I was just wondering, didn't the French and the Brits realize that this was not tenable and that they couldn't sustain this, and that maybe they should start to look more positively at the Republican forces?
Yeah, I mean, they did come to that realization. French came to that realization first, and they made a deal in 1921 with the Ankara government. They basically said, we're going to pull out of southeastern Anatolia, which they'd been allotted. And they basically made it clear to the British, quite clear, that the French were not going to fight to defend Istanbul if the Turks came into the city. So the French realized that sooner. The Italians also realized that, even earlier than the French. They made a deal to evacuate Antalya region. And the British, like I said, many of the British cabinet were advocating already for some kind of reconciliation deal in 1921 with Turkish nationalism, because they saw, for example, Winston Churchill, he was part of the cabinet, and he wanted to do a deal with Turkish nationalists because he thought it was more important to fight the Bolsheviks, and that if they kept fighting the Turkish nationalists, that there would be this Turkish Bolshevik alliance, right? So he wanted to. By the way, the Turks knew that this was a concern of the British, and they also, were suggesting that they would enter, they were already negotiating with the Bolsheviks and making treaties with the Bolsheviks. They used that fear of the British to try and push for reconciliation, in the Lausanne negotiations, for example.
I think the Soviet Union had an embassy to the Ottoman Empire.
The Soviets they had two things. They had a delegate in Ankara who was talking to the Turkish national government, and they also had a trade office in Istanbul, which was meant to just be doing, involved in trade, but had a diplomatic and intelligence character too. So they had a representation. In Istanbul, it came later, after the end of the Russian Civil War, and when the British and French decide that they're going to have to deal with the Bolsheviks, they allow a trade delegation to come to Istanbul. But in terms of this fighting that's going on, and it's complicated. There are a lot of it comes down to this particular commanders, and whether they are loyal to the Sultan or Ankara, and some of them change their minds, sometimes more than once, as to who they want to kind of fight for. And at certain points, the Ottoman government makes efforts to organize military forces and send them into Izmit and towards Adapazarı, Sakarya, and confront the Turkish nationalist forces. None of those efforts are that successful. And yeah, you have all of these bands who are very interesting because, you know, it's always hard to say how much they're fighting with, you know, for an ideological cause, how much they're just trying to survive, you know, how much they're often you have, you know, one village is in this region, you know, just outside of Istanbul, like in Polonezköy and all of this area, you have, you know, different groups like Greek Christian bands and Turkish bands and some mixed bands, and people, you know, they're getting chased around by Ottoman soldiers, gendarmerie with French and British officers, and you know, there's a lot of very complicated micro allegiant alliances and things going on. And you can look at, there's a book by the book called Sorrowful Shores by Ryan Gingeras is very good about this issue of like these armed groups and their politics and practices. He looks at the Marmara region, so he looks specifically at this region around Bursa. So, but there's also a similar thing going on in the Izmir Peninsula, in near to Istanbul.
Just before we have the next question, Craig, could you just read out any comments you've had online?
Well, Ahmet Chulu, and maybe Ahmet Chulu wants to unmute himself and explain how his grandfather was on board of MIM Secret Service in Istanbul during the occupation, shipping arms to Anatolia. So, Ahmet, if you want to unmute yourself and explain what the MIM was, that might be interesting. Please.
Not everyone's Michael Chewley.
Yeah. Well, just give it 1 more minute for Ahmet.
Can you hear me now?
Please, Ahmet, if you want to speak.
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead, Ahmed, please.
Okay. Well, MIM is a secret organization which was founded by Atatürk in place of the Karakol organization, which was organized by the CUP guys. But at one point, my grandfather was also a CUP person, starting from Kavala. But Atatürk and my grandfather also separated their ways from the CUP guys because they were really going in another direction. They found them as savages. They were killing a lot of people. So then MIM organization was placed instead of the Karakol organization, a secret service, whereby they were taking soldiers or army personnel from the Ottoman army and transferring them into Anatolia to fight in the independence war. And also they did a lot of transfer of arms from Istanbul through the Black Sea into Anatolia. I mean, he was well connected. I mean, he was a trade person. I mean, he was not a soldier, but being a CUP guy, I mean, he was interested in helping the independence war. But MIM organization is a secret service, collecting information from Istanbul, transferring them back to Ankara, ammunition, and also personnel, military personnel for the independence war.
Okay.
No, there's a whole lot of underground nationalist activity, and like you said, there's a kind of struggle for control of those organizations between the unionists and Ankara government.
Yes,
there's a good book that's come out just recently by Erol Ulker that looks at this kind of nationalist organization in Istanbul and the rivalry between the unionists and the Kemalists. And the British, of course, are aware of some of this. You know, they're infiltrating some of these groups. They're tapping communications between coming from Anatolia, and they launch a whole wave of arrests of some of these Mimim and other who they see as nationalist agents. One of those people wrote a memoir which has been published. It's called Inglis Hapisonisinden Analara or something. It's one of these operatives who gets arrested and thrown in prison in what is today the Beyoğlu Öğretmenevi, which was then a German hotel that had been confiscated by the British and turned into a prison where they would interrogate all of these suspected nationalist agents. So yes, that's an interesting side of Istanbul's history that I don't look at that much in my work. We're interested in social history, personally, than this kind of political contest.
Thank you. Can you take Michael Riccioli?
Michael, you mentioned that you have a great uncle, a British subject, who worked as a lithographer and draftsman for the Army of the Black Sea for 16 months in 1920.
Yeah.
Please, can you elaborate on that? Any documents or drawings you still got of him?
I don't have more information. I just have the termination letter which says he is a skilled workman and well versed in the two professions mentioned above, and his discharge from this unit was due to the fact that there was not sufficient work to keep him employed. And should any further information regarding his character and abilities be desired, it will be supplied on an application to this office to the best of our knowledge. That's all I have.
Okay. Was his name Riccioli as well, or?
He was called Albert Riccioli. Albert Riccioli.
Okay. All right, I'll see it.
And signed by Captain Hunter.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Question?
You were saying that the British, French, and Italian groups were discussing and had daily or weekly meetings and so on. How much of the content of those meetings were briefed to the Sultan, to the Ottoman Sultan?
Yeah, so what they would often do, those meetings were just the allies, but what they would do when they would make decisions, and they would basically, I don't know, for example, if they decided that roads needed to be repaired, they would write a letter, to normally to the municipal administration of Istanbul and say, you need to do this. But sometimes, they would write to the Ottoman government as well, and they would say to the Ottoman government, that this should be allowed. So one of the big subjects, for example, of dispute between the Ottoman government and the Allies is about setting up this new court to try cases where there were non-Turkish subjects involved. And there's this whole back and forth, where the Allied High Commissioners keep requesting the Ottomans to approve the establishment of this court, and the Ottomans find ways to object, but of course there's a power imbalance, and so normally the Allies get their way eventually in terms of these kind of decisions. But you can actually read, by the way, all of those meetings have been transcribed, and they're published by ISIS Press, by Sinan Kuneralp, in French. I think they're published in French. So it's the minutes of the inter-allied high commissioners meetings, and you can just see how, like I said, what a diverse range of subjects they end up involved with.
Okay, thank you. Any last question?
Let's follow up on that. How was it paid for? I mean, if you write to the municipality and say fix the roads, they're going to get the money.
Yeah. So they generally say that I mean, this is not just something specific, by the way, to Istanbul, but there's this general principle that that there's going to be, the Ottomans are going to pay this big indemnity, war indemnity, and that it should include all of the expenses incurred by the Allies occupying Istanbul. So the Ottomans are eventually meant to pay for this. In terms of things like repair, this specific example of road repairs, it was meant to be paid by the municipality, but the municipality is in and the Ottoman Empire in general is in this huge financial crisis because they lose all of their revenue from Anatolia when the nationalist movement starts taxing people directly and stops sending funds to Istanbul. And so the Allies realize that there's going to be this crisis, and there is a discussion. I don't remember if it ever actually happens, but there's a discussion about raising a loan for the Istanbul municipality so that it can continue to function. And the Allies, actually, this ends up leading to some kind of dilemmas for the Allies. For example, one of the privileges of European subjects in the Ottoman Empire is that they were exempt from certain taxes, right? But they realized what a bad state the Ottoman government's finances are in, and that if the Ottoman government collapses, it's going to be very expensive for the Allies to. And so they basically compromise on their financial privileges of their subjects and say, okay, we'll allow for this new tax to be collected from Allied subjects because, you know, we want the government to keep functioning, basically.
So what is taxed during that time?
Like everything. So there's lots of different taxes. There's the main tax is this thing called temettü tax. But then there are also like specific tax, which is there are like specific taxes too. So for example, one of the really important sources of revenue, especially because the sector expands a lot because of the occupation, is the entertainment taxes. So like every time, I think actually you still have this in Turkey, when you buy a ticket for a theatre or a cinema, it includes a tax that goes to the state. And that tax was actually for like the poorhouse, what's it called? The Darul Ajazi. So there are taxes, there's a tax, another important tax is the tax on alcohol. And that's one area, for example, that tax increases during the occupation, and the Allies allow this increase in alcohol tax to take place. And then there are taxes on like licenses for everything too. Even, you know, brothels have to pay a tax to get their license. And, there's a large increase in the number of brothels. So there are some sources of revenue that are increasing in this period.
No income tax.
I don't know. The temettü, I don't remember exactly what the temettü tax is. It's based on income or land or property. I'm not sure.
Savings.
That's
savings.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are one or two of the audience who want to know, is there a discount available? Apparently it's €100 on.
Yeah, I know. Well, I feel terrible about especially if you translate it into lira, it's horrible.
So maybe you can inform us later, and I can inform these people.
Yeah. I can find I think I have a voucher, but I'm not sure if it's still valid. I'll have to check.
Okay, fingers crossed, all right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think that is probably enough for this evening, but thank you very much, Daniel-Joseph. Thank you to our online audience, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next meeting.
Yeah, thanks for the questions and comments. Listening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.